We recognize you as God of our life, and we thank you that you are a most high God that never falters or makes mistakes. Please help us to see who we are at our core. We are daughters of the Most High God, and every hat that we pick up along the way, the daughter hat, the wife hat, the mother hat, is benefited by our foundation in you. Help us to each see ourselves in the beautifully painted image of you. Show us exactly how to measure our moments, to own our story without guilt or shame, and to meet our needs, even when they seem like impossible things to do. Thank you for the opportunity to gather with each other as the church, to gain clarity and insight in only the way that you can give us. You are such a faithful and loving Father who desires us to be our most authentic self. And we thank you in advance for every answered prayer, healing, and growth. We pray this prayer in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Okay. Well, we are going to get started. Today, we are talking about the story of Eunice. Eunice is mentioned in the Bible, but she's not really expressively talked about as a mother. But her example, her life, the legacy that she left for her child is so impactful. And one of those stories that you could really easily overlook it if you're not familiar. If you're not familiar with the story of Timothy. So Timothy is Eunice's son. And we are going to talk about her personal journey and struggle, her parenting journey and struggle, and her spiritual journey and struggle. And the lessons that we are able to glean from that as mothers and the value that comes from that as both not only mothers, but also women. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys as we start this reading about Eunice. Okay. I don't know why it started in that weird space, but just briefly. So the reason that we are all here is to come together and have a space where we get to experience, recognize, orient ourselves in the context of women who have already walked out the journey of motherhood. One of the valuable things about building community is being able to gain strength from other people's experiences and wisdom from their stories. And that is why we're here. So as we look at Eunice's story, we're going to keep the mom life in mind. And mom life simply means learning to measure your moments, which is choosing to be present enough to give yourself a chance to see you. When you're present, you're able to understand and decide how you want to most effectively use your time and your energy and your resources to create the environment around you that you and your family need. And it is so great to be reminded that your presence is a gift. Not only is your presence a gift, but your personality. Your personality is a gift to your family. Your perspective is a gift to your family. Your voice is a gift to your family. And in having that gift, it means you are exactly who your family needs. And that helps us to own our story. Owning our story means that we see all of the valuable parts of ourselves. We're not diminishing ourselves because of guilt, shame, past mistakes, things we didn't know, but we're recognizing that we are not victims of circumstance. We are victors, and we get to stand centered in our story, to see our experiences, to recognize that we are the masters of our story. We have the opportunity to make informed decisions, to take the things that we've been through and to see how we've triumphed and recognize how they brought us to where we are now. And that helps us to meet our needs. Being vulnerable and honest enough to say, this is where I'm at and this is what I need. This is how I can best show up for myself. This is how I can practice intentional self-love. This is how I can be the most caring and responsive to myself. And that is important. And that's something that Mom Tribe really works to help remind each of us as we journey in motherhood. So within Eunice's story, we see her life in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and then again in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Paul, who was an apostle that went and traveled spreading the good news, Paul came into contact with Eunice, and by way of Eunice, also her son. So he talks about in Acts chapter 16, Paul tells us that he met a disciple whose name was Timothy. And Timothy, his mother was Jewish and was a believer, and his father was Greek. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, we read that Paul, who was the apostle of Christ, met Timothy and embraced him as his own, embraced him as a son. And not only that, but he appreciated the fact that Timothy exemplified the faith, the sincere faith that lived in his grandmother Lois and in his mother Eunice, and that he reflected in the way that he existed. And when Constance and I were first reading the story of Eunice, we were like, oh, wow, this is not a lot to go off of. Like, how much can you really get from these 7 verses? But as we really sat with it, as we really made space to see this woman through the eyes of a mother, the thing that stood out was the fact that Eunice left a legacy that was evident and obvious in her child. Paul came into contact with Timothy, and because of who his mother had chosen to be and exemplified to him by her choices, he embraced and exemplified that exact same legacy by faith. And faith is us choosing to be empowered in the belief and the understanding of who we are as reflected in the image of the living God. So there was something about Eunice and how she lived, how she moved, how she operated, how she communicated, how she thought, that her son interpreted. He was not only able to interpret it, but he was able to exemplify and exhibit that in the way that he operated with other people. And it was attributable to her as his mother. In Proverbs, Solomon talks a lot about mothers being instructors and fathers giving commands. And when you step back and consider our role is to instruct, the instruction that comes from mothers is usually done through nurturing and through our nature. It is both nature and nurture that we exhibit to our kids who we are, and they interpret that in a sense of self, and it helps them define who they are. And that is something that we see so powerfully in Eunice's story in a way that is almost, to me, mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing that she exemplified herself. She lived in both nature and nurture to instruct her child, that he interpreted that as being a part of who he was and could live that out in the context of being around other people. And it really does help to influence the understanding that we are legacy building. In every moment that we show up for our kids in the day, we are legacy building. The way that we give ourselves the space to communicate with them in moments of chaos, or comfort them in moments of struggle, or to create an environment around them where they are free to be themselves. That's legacy building and being able to see them. And so through Eunice's life, we learn the importance of building that legacy. It requires our intention. It requires our honesty and transparency to build boundaries, real boundaries. And then being steadfast, even when our kids are not being the best version of themselves, even when we don't feel like the best version of ourselves, we are choosing to be steadfast enough to keep showing up, to keep recognizing that who we are is exactly who our family needs. And we do this by communicating, by cultivating, and creating. And so we're going to see Eunice's story in the context of how she did these things. First is her personal struggle. Eunice was married to a man who did not share her same faith or culture. They were of both different culture and different belief systems. But she was able to maintain her sense of self, her identity, even in being married to and co-parenting with her husband who didn't share those things with her. And as we were talking, Constance and I realized in order to do this, it takes an extreme amount of communication. Not only does it take an extreme amount of communication, but it takes clarity in communication. So whether you are married, separated, single parenting, we all as mothers have to have the ability to communicate with clarity, to set safeguards around what we hold as valuable, of what we believe about ourselves, about our own systems of faith or our own values and beliefs. We have to be able to safeguard those because those become part of our legacy. And if we don't recognize and understand how to build that in through our communication, it can be hard to see how that shows up in our kids. It can be a challenge to even get them to understand and interpret that for themselves. The challenge in holding on to the core parts of ourselves, the challenge is real as a mother. There are moments when I can't speak for everybody. I can only speak for me. But there are moments when there are core parts of who you are, who you've always been, who you know yourself to be. As a mom, there are moments when that is challenged. And you may end up wondering, is this worth it? Is it worth holding on to this part of myself? Is there something that I need to change? Is there something that I need to redefine in recognizing who I am? But learning to be steadfast in what we believe, learning to be steadfast in what we value, and holding on to the important core parts that we never lose is key to showing up for ourselves, but then in also building the legacy that our children get to hold on to and exemplify when they're away from us, right? That's each of our hopes, that even when our kids aren't with us, there's enough integrity there. There's enough core sense of self that they don't allow themselves to be pulled away or swayed or pressured into forsaking themselves. That's a common desire. It's a legitimate desire as a mother, but we can sometimes distance ourselves from recognizing, are we doing that? Are we holding on to the core sense of ourselves? Do we have a strong enough understanding of our identity to not allow who we are to be lost in the shuffle of motherhood, of wife life, of single parenting, of partnering with other people or existing in other spaces, whether it's work or school or in the larger context of family, familial relationships that are challenging? Are you maintaining your identity? Are you holding on to those parts of yourself that are so imperative that you don't lose sight of you? I think that's a question worth considering when we recognize that we are building a legacy. We are our legacy, who we show up as for our kids through our identity. And then learning to practice and find balance in meeting our needs. That's how we exemplify our values. If you tell your kids you have to love yourself, but they don't see you tending to yourself, they don't see you investing in yourself, they don't see you caring for yourself, they don't see that my mom has goals and she's pursuing them. My mom has intention and she's living in it. My mom doesn't allow herself to fall by the wayside or to shrink in her role as a mother. That becomes their inspiration because they learn how to be them by how we choose to be ourselves. Do we matter enough to say, you know what, today I'm going to be intentional about caring for myself? My health matters too. You know what, today I'm going to be intentional about using my voice and honoring my boundaries. I'm not going to allow the needs of everybody else to become so overwhelming that I don't focus on myself. That is the truest way that we communicate with our children who we are and our values. And then we use that to learn to live with intention, because the vision that we have of ourselves is going to show up in how we care for ourselves. It's going to show up in how we maintain our identity. Are we changing with every season? Are we losing the core essence of who we are? Are we allowing situations and circumstances to cause us to shrink or fall away from what we know to be true about who we are? When we are intentional about the vision that we have for ourselves and we communicate that with our children, it's important for you to have a vision and a goal and to go after it and to strive for it. It's important to take time and process the new seasons of your life, how things change. It's important to celebrate your wins. It's important to acknowledge that your voice as a mother, your role, your identity, everything about you matters. And the only way to live with that kind of intention is to live in the fullness of self. And that's in communication and in action. It can be challenging, especially when our kids hit those milestones that come with extra wordage, extra expression, extra emotion. It can be challenging. It can be very challenging to be intentional about how you show up for yourself. It can be very challenging to see that boundary that you've set and say, it's not moving. It's not moving because that boundary honors me. It's important for us to make time for ourselves, to have a vision which becomes a standard. So no, you can't do that. No, we can't go there. No, we can't coexist in this way. No, we're not going to breed dysfunction. Those are important to living in the intention of ourselves. And there had to be a clear way that Eunice was communicating this exact understanding through her identity and her values and her intention for herself that her child saw. He saw it so much that when he was in contact with other people, it was instantly evident. And as moms, sometimes our kids don't fully reflect what we're trying to impart, what we're trying to exemplify. And it's because they still need time. They need time to process these things. They need time to recall these things. They need time to grow in the understanding. But it doesn't mean that it's not without value for you to be you, for you to hold on to the core parts of you so that they see it and they understand it. That is key. Because as moms, what our kids do, who they choose to be, sometimes it can be hard to not interpret that. It can be hard to not see that as a reflection of who we are or who we've been. But there is space for everybody to grow. There is space for each of us to learn from our mistakes and to evolve. There is space for that. And the same way that we had space as moms, as women, to go through that, our kids also need the space to go through that. And that's where the parenting struggle gets real. And you're going through your mind wondering, okay, how am I supposed to exist here? And one of the ways that we see that is that often There can be self-doubt. There can be doubt about, am I even supposed to be a mom? Am I messing my kids up? Am I doing this right? Am I destroying people, other people who are depending on me? Is this worth it? That doubt can be resounding. It can be so loud and overwhelming. But learning to let that question exist and then answer it in action is so key, because it teaches us how to balance self-doubt with self-assurance. And recognizing, I'm so sorry, guys, I have a dog who's very protective. Recognizing how to realize that you are doing enough and you are being who you're meant to be. And you can let that question exist and also show up in response and action. Those are important. Did I mess up something here? And then saying, okay, no, let me go through a checklist in my mind. I heard out my child. I listened. I gave space for them to have their feelings and emotions. I communicated what the standard was, because I have a vision for who I want to be to my children and how I want them to see themselves. I showed up for them. I cared for them. That's the balance. Letting the question exist and then looking at how you've shown up brings that balance. And it's a tough question because sometimes it can stir up feelings. It can be hard to grapple with, especially if you've grown up in dysfunctional environments or in contentious relationships with your own parents. But it gives us the opportunity to cultivate the kind of environment where our kids have a chance to be themselves, but where we equally have a chance to be ourselves, where we have a chance to cultivate the space for our own evolution and say, oh, old me would not have responded this way. Old me would not have recognized the value in saying, you know what, I need a moment. And taking a moment instead of instantly being responsive. There's value in that. And then we look at the transparency and the legacy of Eunice. Because in cultivating a vision for ourselves, it can be a struggle to live transparently. Sometimes the thought can be, am I oversharing with my kids? Am I making myself too accessible? Am I communicating enough? Am I creating and cultivating the right space? Especially if you're living in the shadow of either family legacy, religious traditions, or even cultural expectations. That can be hard. There are a lot of cultural norms that have been normalized that are actually dysfunctional. And when you choose to parent differently, when you choose to parent with legacy building in mind, it creates and cultivates within you a sense of understanding that, okay, I cannot operate at a default. It can't be reflexive. It has to be intentional. I have to be transparent enough to say, hey, this is an area where I'm still growing or where I'm still learning. How can we collaborate here? How can I give you what you need while also giving myself space? And that's not always an easy thing to communicate to a child, but it can look different based on where we are, based on where they are. It could be as simple as, hey, let's figure out a way to partner. Let's figure out a way to do this together so that we can build our relationship. Hey, let's make sure that we're communicating with consideration. Let's be intentional about what we say and how we say it. Because that is cultivating legacy building in a transparent way. And learning to intentionally parent means you're not being reflexive or reactionary, but you're taking the time to respond. One of the things that really stood out to me was that Paul talked about Lois, Timothy's grandmother, having the same ability and the same sincere faith that was then passed down to Eunice, that was then passed down to Timothy. That's a generational history of sincerity and of self-understanding, self-awareness, self-intention, because it takes both awareness and intention to be faithful. It takes being honest about where you are, but certain about where you're moving, where you're going, the vision that you have of yourself, and constantly recalibrating and realigning your intention and your action to make sure that what you're doing is going to get you there. That is an amazing legacy to pass down. And it's also hard. That does not come easy, and it doesn't come without intention. So being aware and cultivating the right conditions that say, okay, I'm going to avoid generational cycles of dysfunction while building in healthy, fully intentional cycles of self-awareness, cycles of being conscious about how my speech, my actions, my presence matter for my children and myself. That's important. That is key in parenting with intention to build a legacy. And as we've looked over the lives of these women, Eunice and the widow at Zarephath, and even, I can't remember her name. The sister, what's her name? Abraham's wife's?
Sarah, our study on Hagar.
Hagar. And even Hagar. We see that all of these women were legacy building. All of them were legacy building. And in the moments, you don't recognize that that's what it is. It feels like just living. It feels like just showing up every day to be this person to these people. But it is legacy building. And when we're intentional about how we parent, when we're intentional about how we show up, those are the moments where we can see the legacy being built in real time, in action. When you respond to your child differently than your reflexive tendency or your generational trauma wants to, that's legacy building. When you can be present enough to both nature and nurture your child through your instruction, that's legacy building. When you show up for them in a way that resonates in the heart of who they are because you see them, you see their needs, and you respond to the need and not the behavior. That is legacy building. But most importantly, legacy building is how you center yourself in all of that. Because Eunice could not have gotten so caught up in trying to be her mom, and she could not have gotten so caught up in trying to be Timothy's mom that she lost sight of herself. Because if she lost sight of herself, there would be no legacy to give. The legacy would be forsake yourself. Put yourself last. Silence your voice. Shrink. And don't show up for you. That would have been the legacy. But she was able to balance who she was, who she wanted to be, by her actions. And that became the legacy that her son exemplified. When he was by himself, when he was with her, when he was with other people. What an amazing way to see that we have the power to cultivate, to truly cultivate who our children understand themselves to be. That understanding is cultivated by who we are, by how we show up for ourselves, by how we honor ourselves, by how we make space to be transparent, by how we make space to parent with intention, to break cycles and to create positive habits and change. And for there to only be 7 verses about this woman, it is amazing to see that she possessed those abilities. She understood what it meant to communicate and to cultivate her own sense of self, that it became tangible and visible and evident in a way that her son was then able to live out for himself, live in and live out for himself. And so then we see her spiritual journey. One of the things that is really captivating about Eunice is that her faith had to have been powerful. Her faith, which was the vision that she had for herself, coupled with how she lived in that, to know who she wanted to be and where she was going, and to the power to align her time, her decision making, her energy and resources in that direction without losing hope. She was steadfast and she was intentional. And that created a positive cycle that her son could then replicate. How amazing is that understanding? But then also when we look at ourselves, it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge to see our own ability to do that, to create positive cycles of change. And we just talked about how we do that. It's about not being reflexive or reactionary. It's about not shrinking or diminishing our sense of self. But it's also about showing up and communicating our needs. And you can only meet your needs if you're introspective enough to be in tune with them. Deep introspection, understanding of how you need to heal, and giving yourself permission and the space to do that is important. Recognizing what your experiences have taught you, how your perspective has been shaped, and how that shows up. That's important to passing on healthier ways of existing for our children. When we say it's okay to say that something hurt you, and to allow that emotional processing to happen. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be disappointed. It's okay to feel. And let me help you process that so that you don't get stuck in your feelings. Let me nurture and nature you so that you see the power that you hold, and you see the purpose of your life, and you see the worth of who you are. Even when the experience isn't great, what can we take away from it? And it requires deep introspection because that allows us to constantly learn. It allows us to constantly learn from the environments that we exist in. It allows us to constantly learn from the experiences that we go through and not take anything negative away from them. That's part of owning our story. Yes, this happened. This happened to me, but I didn't get stuck there. And just because it happened to me doesn't mean that it is the identifier of my value. It doesn't mean that that's who I am. I am not my circumstances. I am not a situation. I exist outside of these situations, and I can see them with clarity to understand how to grow from them. Nothing gets to defeat me because I was made with purpose. And when we are able to see that, we can create the healthy environments, making the choices that reflect our values and show our children, this is a safe space for you. I want to create a safe space for you to exist in, to learn from, and to grow through. Because that is part of our role as mothers in instructing and nurturing. We are supposed to be creating spaces for our kids to see the fullness of themselves. And even when it's challenging, even when they're struggling to see themselves, because we serve such a loving and divine and intentional God, He will show you how to show up for them. And typically, how we show up for them first starts with how we show up for ourselves. If they're struggling to see their value, it's you giving yourself the opportunity to affirm them. It's you giving yourself permission to embrace them, to acknowledge their efforts, to remind them it's okay. Take it a day at a time. It's okay. This is not where you stay. I want you to learn from this. I want you to see the value in who you are, then grow through it. And I'm going to be here to help you in the same way that the living God does that for us. He says, it's okay. It's okay to have to learn. It's okay to be challenged in this area. But I want you to learn. I want you to be present and responsive to yourself enough to learn. Be vulnerable and transparent and say what you don't know. Say what you need. Tell me, because I want you to learn through this. And I don't want you to stay here. Then I want you to grow through it. And to be able to share that and give that to our children is important in helping to create their sense of identity. Being able to give them the permission and the space, creating that space to say all of these parts of who you are matter. You don't have to silence them. You don't have to dismiss them. You don't have to shrink them or diminish them. You get to have all of these parts. You get to be multidimensional. I don't want you to just be one thing. And I don't want you to lose a part of yourself to please other people or make yourself shrink and quiet so that it makes other people comfortable. We have the power to create spaces where our kids get to see themselves fully, where we get to see ourselves fully. So yes, you may be a wife, you may be a mother, you may be a nurse, or yes, you may be a single mom and you may be a receptionist and you may be a sister. But all of those parts of you matter, and all of those parts of you deserve to show up in the spaces that you occupy so that you can be the truest version of yourself, where you're not trying to figure out how to be all of these different things to different people. That is burdening. That is stressful. But when we are just true to who we are, and we're constantly giving ourselves permission to change and evolve and embrace who we are becoming, that is the key to helping us not only honor our sense of identity, but create the space for our kids to do the same. So in Eunice's life, we see some very important mental health takeaways. And if you would like to take a screenshot of this slide, feel free, because these concepts are so empowering when you look at them and you recognize, like, this is what the Lord desires for each of us. This is the only way that we can live in sincere faith. The only way. Self-authorship means taking ownership of your beliefs, your identity, your values, and being able to hold those separate from other people. So yes, you may have grown up in a family that believes or feels this way, but you don't have to. If it doesn't resonate with who you are, if it's not reflective of the vision that you have of your best self and living as the best version of you in all of these parts of your life, mom, coworker, employer, friend, sister, if it doesn't help you to exist in all of those parts, you're allowed to lay them aside. You're allowed to say no. That's self-authorship. I can take my beliefs, my values, my identity, and I can hold them exigent outside of other people. That means I'm not looking for approval. I'm not looking for validation. I'm standing in the fullness of myself and the vision that I have of my life. And then my sincere faith shows up by recalibrating and aligning my decision-making, my resource allocation, my time management in that direction so that I'm in alignment with what I desire for myself. And that's where the self-discipline shows up. That is you having the awareness to set healthy boundaries around your vision, around your legacy building. So if it means we don't have certain conversations with certain people, we don't. If it means we don't go certain places with our kids because we recognize that there could be some negative patterns of behavior or thinking that can emerge, then we don't go there. If it means that we don't watch these kinds of shows in our home because we want to make sure that we're being intentional about what we feed our minds because our thoughts become our actions, then we don't watch those kinds of shows. And all of those things, when you communicate them with clarity and you help your children by communicating and cultivating the understanding to create the environment where they can see themselves in the context of that, that's legacy building. When you help your children to set a standard around the kinds of friends that they want, that's legacy building. When you give your kids permission to recognize and honor their own opinion in a respectful and responsible way so that they learn to use their voice, that's legacy building. But you can only do that with healthy boundary setting, and that comes from self-discipline. Then we see the self-actualization, and that is learning to give yourself space to be present enough to show up for yourself, to recognize where you're growing, where you're evolving, and even to recognize how you want to grow, how you want to evolve, so that everything that you do is in alignment with the truest version of you, your sincere faith and your authentic best self. Deserve the space to exist, but they cannot do that if you're not self-actualizing. So that means we have to be introspective. We have to be present to say, oh, I don't like how this day went. I don't like it. What do I need to change for tomorrow? Where do I need to set new boundaries? What do I need to let go of? Am I holding burdens or weights? Am I operating based on dysfunctional patterns of thinking? Am I replicating generational cycles? Do I have a tendency to move towards a negative perspective or approach in handling situations? If I do, how can I find the tools, the resources, and the systems of support to change this? That is the self-actualization that has to take place in order for us to be purposeful in ourselves and our legacy building. And then lastly, the self-empowerment. That is living with intention to break those cycles, knowing that you possess everything that you need to be the best version of yourself. You possess everything that you need to walk in the power that you've already been given. The power of choice, the power to say no, the power to redefine, the power to lay aside. You already have it. You don't have to wait for anybody's permission. You don't have to decide based on other people's timetables or other people's expectations. Your self-empowerment is the Lord's gift to you as a mother. And more importantly, it's essential for you to hold it for yourself. Eunice's story gives us a purposefully lived example. She built on the legacy that her mom left her. But she not only built on it, she acclimated it. She tailored it to herself. She made it reflective of who she was so that she could live in it with sincerity and authenticity in a way that allowed it to be exemplified and interpreted by her child. And that is something that we all possess. It's the ability to live out our vision. But it requires that we work purposefully, that we have healthy boundaries, and that we break the cycles that don't build or bless us. So as we look at Eunice's story and we recognize how ours aligns, take some time over the week, over the rest of this year, as you start the new year, and ask yourself, gauge how you have progressed in your own journey, how you are feeling in your own role as a mother. How are you honoring yourself? And you can do that by asking yourself some of these questions. Are you practicing intentional parenting to break cycles that support self-awareness for yourself and your children? Are you actively building and sharing a legacy, the legacy that you intend? Are you creating positive generational cycles? Are you setting standards and boundaries so that your children understand who you are? And we don't want to just know these things, but we want to live these things. So that means that you deserve to give yourself a chance to apply and practice being steadfast, to remember yourself and meet your needs, to trust your energy and your efforts. And if it helps, please take a screenshot of this slide so that it doesn't just stay here, but that this understanding lives in each moment as you move on from this space. And then we have our affirmation. I am a mother who persists and perseveres through the challenges I face. I choose to be steadfast in who I am, setting clear boundaries and communicating with love and sincerity. I live a life centered around my faith and intention, setting an example that is a reflection of my ability to honor myself as a woman and mother. I break negative cycles and practice purposeful parenting, supporting self-awareness and building positive generational cycles. My legacy is built on power, love, and self-discipline, guiding my children to understand their own purpose through grace. I live with a clear conscience and authenticity by making decisions aligned with my boundaries and best to live with intention.